The origins of the Afghanistan War of 2001 lie at the intersection of late 20th century geopolitical transformations, the evolution of transnational jihadist movements, the internal collapse of Afghan political authority, and the strategic recalibration of U.S. foreign policy after the September 11 attacks. Although the American-led invasion began on October 7, 2001, the roots of that decision stretch back decades to the Cold War contest between the United States and the Soviet Union, the regional rivalries of South Asia and the Middle East, and the ideological ferment that gave rise to militant groups like al-Qaeda. Understanding why the United States invaded Afghanistan requires reconstructing the environment that allowed a relatively small extremist network to operate from a devastated country and carry out the deadliest terrorist strike on American soil, thereby compelling the U.S. government to reorganize its national security priorities in unprecedented ways. Afghanistan in the late 20th century had become a theater of instability and foreign intervention, beginning with the 1979 Soviet invasion. The U.S. response, supporting anti-Soviet mujahideen groups through Pakistan's inter-services intelligence, helped transform Afghanistan into a crucible of global jihad. While Washington's objective at the time was geopolitical containment of the USSR, the long-term consequence was the creation of a vast militant infrastructure that survived the Soviet withdrawal in 1989. Much of Afghanistan's social, economic, and political order collapsed during the Soviet occupation and the subsequent civil war. By the mid-1990s, no central government effectively controlled the country. Warlords dominated local regions, and the country's physical infrastructure lay in ruins. Out of this chaos emerged the Taliban movement, a group of religious students promising order, justice, and the establishment of an Islamic emirate. The Taliban captured Kabul in 1996 and soon controlled most of Afghanistan. Their rule was characterized by extreme interpretations of Islamic law, the repression of women, and the destruction of cultural heritage. Yet for many war-weary Afghans, the Taliban's consolidation of control offered respite from the violent fragmentation that had defined the preceding decade.
The Taliban's ascent coincided with the rising ambitions of Osama bin Laden and his organization, al-Qaeda. After being expelled from Sudan in 1996 under pressure from the United States and its allies, bin Laden relocated to Afghanistan, where the Taliban granted him sanctuary. The partnership between the Taliban and al-Qaeda was not inevitable. It arose out of mutual convenience, ideological overlap, and personal relationships forged during the anti-Soviet jihad. Bin Laden provided financial support, offered military expertise, and helped attract foreign fighters, while the Taliban gave al-Qaeda the territorial safe haven necessary to build training camps, ideological indoctrination centers, and logistical networks. Although the Taliban's focus remained largely domestic, centered on imposing their vision of Islamic governance within Afghanistan, al-Qaeda's aspirations were explicitly transnational, targeting what bin Laden described as the far enemy, primarily the United States. By the late 1990s, Afghanistan had become the hub of a global terrorist enterprise, operating largely beyond the reach of international law enforcement. Meanwhile, the United States had been slow to grasp the full implications of al-Qaeda's rise. The Clinton administration recognized the threat after the 1998 bombings of the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, which killed more than 200 people and wounded thousands. Washington responded by launching cruise missile strikes on suspected al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan, narrowly missing bin Laden. However, these limited actions did not dismantle al-Qaeda's infrastructure nor significantly pressure the Taliban to expel the group. U.S. strategy at the time remained constrained by concerns about sovereignty, regional sensitivities, and the absence of domestic political appetite for large-scale military engagement. This allowed al-Qaeda to continue planning operations, culminating in the attack on the USS Cole in October 2000. The warning signs were visible, but the American national security establishment had not yet elevated counterterrorism to the strategic priority it would become after September 11.
The September 11, 2001 attacks represent the pivotal moment that transformed U.S. perceptions of both Afghanistan and international terrorism. 19 al-Qaeda operatives hijacked 4 commercial airliners, crashing 2 into the World Trade Center, 1 into the Pentagon, and 1 into a field in Pennsylvania after passengers resisted. Nearly 3,000 people were killed, making it the deadliest terrorist attack in world history.
The attacks shattered the sense of American invulnerability that had defined the post-Cold War era and catalyzed a sweeping reorientation of U.S. national security policy. Within hours, intelligence agencies identified al-Qaeda as responsible, and within days, the U.S. government concluded that Afghanistan, where al-Qaeda leadership resided under Taliban protection, was the central node of the threat. President George W. Bush articulated a new doctrine. No distinction would be made between terrorists and the states that harbored them. This principle became the legal and moral foundation for the invasion of Afghanistan. Diplomatic efforts preceded military action. In the weeks following September 11, the United States issued an ultimatum to the Taliban: hand over Osama bin Laden and dismantle al-Qaeda camps or face severe consequences. The Taliban leadership, led by Mullah Muhammad Omar, refused to comply unequivocally. Although Taliban officials signaled a willingness to discuss bin Laden's fate, they insisted on evidence of his involvement and sought to negotiate terms inconsistent with U.S. demands. Washington interpreted this refusal as confirmation that the Taliban were complicit in protecting terrorists and therefore liable to be targeted. The international community largely supported the U.S. position. NATO invoked Article 5 for the first time in its history, declaring the attacks on the United States to be an attack on all members. The United Nations Security Council passed resolutions affirming the right of self-defense and calling on states to deny safe haven to terrorists. With diplomatic avenues exhausted, military intervention became the chosen course. The U.S. invasion began on October 7, 2001, under the operational name Operation Enduring Freedom. The initial objectives were narrowly defined: destroy al-Qaeda, capture or kill its leadership, and remove the Taliban from power to prevent Afghanistan from continuing to serve as a base for global terrorism. U.S. strategy depended heavily on air power, CIA paramilitary teams, and partnerships with Afghan opposition factions collectively known as the Northern Alliance. Within 2 months, Kabul fell, and the Taliban regime collapsed as its fighters retreated into Pakistan or blended into the rural population. Al-Qaeda's training camps were destroyed, and many operatives were captured or killed. Although bin Laden himself escaped during the Battle of Tora Bora in December 2001, U.S. leaders declared the initial phase of the war a success, believing they had significantly degraded al-Qaeda's capabilities. However, the reasons for the U.S. invasion cannot be confined solely to the immediate aftermath of September 11th. Several deeper structural and ideological factors shaped American decision-making. First, the United States sought to reassert its global leadership in an era suddenly marked by uncertainty. The 1990s had been defined by the unipolar moment, during which the U.S. faced no peer competitors and exercised unmatched military and economic influence. The 9/11 attacks threatened not only American lives, but also the credibility of U.S. power. A forceful response in Afghanistan served as both retribution and a demonstration of resolve. Second, the Bush administration viewed terrorism through a lens influenced by neoconservative ideology, which held that rogue states, extremist networks, and weapons of mass destruction collectively threatened global stability. Removing the Taliban was seen not just as punishment for harboring al-Qaeda, but as part of a broader project to reshape the Middle East and South Asia in ways favorable to U.S. interests.
Third, the invasion reflected long-standing concerns about failed states as incubators of transnational threats. Afghanistan in 2001 exemplified the dangers of ungoverned spaces where militants could operate with impunity. U.S. policymakers believed that denying such sanctuaries was essential to preventing future attacks. This reasoning influenced not only military action, but also post-invasion planning, which focused on establishing a stable Afghan government capable of preventing extremist resurgence. While the initial goal was counter-terrorism, nation-building quickly became intertwined with U.S. strategy, reflecting the belief that sustainable security required political reconstruction. The 2001 Bonn Agreement laid the groundwork for a new Afghan political order, culminating in the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan under President Hamid Karzai. Although not part of the original invasion rationale, the commitment to rebuilding Afghanistan became one of the defining features of the war. Another factor behind the invasion was the international environment following September 11, which uniquely enabled U.S. action. Rarely in history had global sympathy for the United States been so widespread. Major powers, including Russia, China, and the European Union, expressed support for American retaliation. Even traditional U.S. rivals saw al-Qaeda as a mutual threat. Pakistan, which had previously supported the Taliban, abruptly shifted its policy under pressure from Washington, providing logistical support, intelligence cooperation, and access to airspace. This convergence of international support gave the United States diplomatic legitimacy and operational flexibility that might not have existed under other circumstances. The war in Afghanistan was therefore not simply an American undertaking, but a coalition effort with broad, though not universal, backing.
Yet the path to invasion also involves significant misunderstandings about Afghanistan itself. U.S. policymakers underestimated the Taliban's resilience, overestimated the ability of Afghan factions to unify under a new government, and misread the complexities of regional politics. The assumption that the Taliban's defeat would be permanent proved incorrect, as the group reorganized in Pakistan's tribal areas and launched an insurgency that would last 2 decades. These later developments, however, do not diminish the fact that in 2001 the primary U.S. motivation was self-defense against a non-state actor enabled by a hostile regime. The invasion was justified to the American public as a necessary act to prevent further attacks and to dismantle the infrastructure of global terrorism at its source. From a legal standpoint, the U.S. framed the invasion as an exercise of the inherent right of self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. Congress authorized the use of military force against those responsible for September 11 through the Authorization for Use of Military Force, or AUMF, granting the president broad powers to pursue al-Qaeda and associated forces. The combination of domestic legal authority and international support created a uniquely robust mandate for military action. Critics later questioned the interpretation of self-defense, arguing that the Taliban did not directly participate in the attacks and that further diplomatic channels could have been pursued. Nonetheless, in the immediate post-9/11 climate, such objections carried little weight. The overwhelming public sentiment favored decisive action, and political consensus around the necessity of invasion was unusually strong. Economic and strategic considerations also played indirect roles. Although Afghanistan itself held little economic value, the region's stability was significant for broader international concerns, including energy security in Central Asia and the geopolitical ambitions of Pakistan, Iran, Russia, and China. A destabilized Afghanistan had long contributed to regional tensions, drug trafficking, refugee crises, and the proliferation of armed groups. By intervening, the United States aimed, at least implicitly, to shape the security architecture of South and Central Asia. Pakistan's cooperation was essential, yet fraught with complexity, given its internal divisions, historical ties to the Taliban, and rivalry with India. For Washington, the war offered an opportunity to pressure Pakistan to sever its ties to extremist groups, though the effectiveness of this strategy would remain contested for years.
Ideological narratives played an important role in justifying the invasion to domestic and international audiences. President Bush's rhetoric framed the conflict as part of a global struggle between civilization and terror, casting the United States as the defender of freedom against totalitarian extremism. This framing resonated with American cultural narratives of moral clarity and righteous struggle. It also helped generate broad public support for the war, which, at its outset, was one of the most popular military actions in modern U.S. history. Although the Bush administration initially emphasized the counterterrorism objective, it soon incorporated themes of human rights, women's liberation, and democratization, particularly when discussing Afghanistan's new government. These additional motives were not central to the decision to invade, but became part of the evolving justification for the prolonged U.S. presence. Another deeper cause was the structural vulnerability of the international system to asymmetric threats. By the early 2000s, globalization had interconnected the world in ways that allowed ideas, money, and people, including militants, to move rapidly across borders.
Al-Qaeda exploited these networks to plan and coordinate operations from Afghanistan, despite the country's poverty and isolation. The U.S. invasion was therefore understood not only as retaliation, but also as a necessary adaptation to a new kind of security threat, one that required preemptive action against sanctuaries before attacks could be launched. This strategic logic would later influence broader U.S. policies and help shape the war on terror, including interventions in other parts of the world. The historical legacy of the Afghan-Soviet War also contributed to the invasion's origins by shaping the institutional memory of both the United States and militant networks. Many al-Qaeda leaders, including bin Laden, viewed the Soviet withdrawal as evidence that a superpower could be defeated through sustained guerrilla warfare and ideological persistence. This belief encouraged them to target the United States, hoping to replicate what they saw as the Afghan victory over the Soviets. Conversely, American policymakers drew the opposite lesson, that power vacuums in Afghanistan could have global repercussions if left unaddressed. The United States entered the war aware of Afghanistan's history as a graveyard of empires, but confident that superior technology, coalition support, and limited objectives would prevent a similar fate. While this confidence would later be challenged, it is essential to understanding the mindset of 2001.
The role of intelligence assessments also shaped the invasion's trajectory. After 9/11, the U.S. intelligence community quickly determined that al-Qaeda operated from Afghan territory with the explicit consent of the Taliban. Declassified documents show that American officials believed that if al-Qaeda were not dismantled swiftly, further attacks could occur, potentially involving chemical, biological, or even nuclear materials. This worst-case thinking contributed to the sense of urgency. Even though al-Qaeda's capabilities in 2001 were significant but limited, the psychological impact of 9/11 magnified perceptions of threat and reduced tolerance for ambiguity. In this climate, policymakers were inclined to favor decisive action over caution, leading to the rapid initiation of military operations. The humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, while not a primary cause of the invasion, shaped the international community's perception of the conflict. Years of war had produced widespread poverty, famine, and displacement. The Taliban's governance worsened these conditions through restrictive policies, international isolation, and the destruction of agricultural livelihoods, including the ban on opium cultivation in 2000. When the United States framed part of its mission around helping Afghans rebuild their country, it found receptive audiences in Europe and among humanitarian organizations. This alignment of strategic and humanitarian narratives contributed to the broad coalition that supported the initial invasion. Furthermore, the Taliban's diplomatic isolation left them vulnerable. Only 3 states, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, recognized the Taliban government before 2001. Most countries considered the Taliban illegitimate because they had seized power by force, violated human rights, and provided sanctuary to terrorists. After 9/11, even Pakistan formally withdrew its recognition under U.S. pressure. This lack of international legitimacy made it easier for the United States to justify military action without facing the diplomatic hurdles that might have accompanied intervention in a widely recognized sovereign government. The Taliban's pariah status accelerated their collapse when confronted with overwhelming military force.
Yet, the war's origins also reveal how decisions made under crisis conditions can expand beyond their initial scope. What began as a targeted mission to destroy al-Qaeda evolved into a much larger project of nation-building, counterinsurgency, and regional diplomacy. The Bush administration initially believed that Afghanistan could be stabilized quickly, allowing the U.S. to focus on other priorities. However, the Taliban regrouped, ethnic and political divisions resurfaced, and corruption undermined the new Afghan government. Over time, the war's goals became broader and more ambiguous, complicating assessments of success and failure. Nonetheless, in examining why the United States invaded in 2001, it is clear that the immediate motive was both reactive and preventative: to dismantle a terrorist organization responsible for a catastrophic attack and to eliminate the regime that enabled it.